We thank St. Peter's and St. Paul's for allowing us to host this event here, and we give thanks to our God and Father through Jesus, his Son, on this day of remembrance for his blessings of freedom, and we ask for their continuance. And now comes the commercial. Augustine College was founded about 25 years ago by professors who saw the secular university pursue a disenchanting and fractured approach to knowledge that left students prey to vain philosophies. The college works to restore the Christian tradition of education, of the integrated formation of the Christian spirit based on the pursuit of truth, goodness, and beauty as found in the classical tradition, recapturing the coherence and purpose of an education to the glory of God, of supported people able to engage the world in grace and truth. As an ecumenical college, we affirm the Apostles' Creed and believe that those from different Christian denominations can work together in harmony. We offer a one-year program covering the history of thought in both the ancient and modern world, immersing our students in the study of philosophy, literature, art, science, music, medicine, politics, scripture, logic, Latin. Should I stop? With this foundation, students are strengthened to confidently address their post-secondary studies. As a community and fellowship, these are fundamental parts of our broader educational effort. Our monthly dialogues are open to all and offer a sustained and intimate setting for engagement with the insights of all ages. So if you've been itching a regular place to kick up your feet, laugh, and read books together alongside other Christians, please add your name to the sign-up sheet, which I believe is upstairs in the reception hall. And of course, next year is approaching, the next school year. So especially parents, grandparents, and students, be encouraged. We accept no more than 25 students, and we will accept as few as we get. Your support is critical. Please visit our website or speak with us directly for more information. And now, without further ado, I will turn the mic over to Barry to introduce both himself and the speaker.
Thanks so very much, and thank you to Augustine College for partnering with us for the First Freedoms Foundation. This is our third annual Diefenbaker lecture, and it's an important time of the year. We tried to do it right around the Remembrance Day time, simply because the whole issues that we want to raise with the Diefenbaker lecture, issues dealing with freedom and so forth, is a solemn, really, matter that needs to be discussed. And so I want to thank each of you for coming. And this year we are so pleased to have Dr. Julie Ponesse, who's going to be delivering our lecture tonight. And Dr. Ponesse is an individual who stands for her conscience. In a world where people are bought and sold for all kinds of things, Dr. Ponesse has showed herself to be an individual who could not be bought or sold and paid a personal price. And those of you who know her story, and perhaps she may share some of it tonight, but it's an inspirational story. And we're so thankful that she is here and was willing to make the journey all the way from London, where she lives with her family there. And I got to know her just a little bit, basically during this entire COVID experience. I call it the COVID experience, but it's interesting. We've met a lot of new friends. We lost some friends. We gained some friends. It is quite an interesting experience, really, and yet it still reverberates. One of the things that we tried to do at First Freedoms Foundation is to pay attention to three particular freedoms. And the reason we call it First Freedoms is because in a 1953 decision at the Supreme Court of Canada, Justice Ivan Rand made mention of the original freedoms. They were freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and the inviolability of the person. And that's where we got our name. And it's been an area of concern for us as we engage in discussions with various thought leaders, practical, or I should say in professions as well, whether it's in medicine or whether it's in law and so on, who have had to struggle with those freedoms over the last little while. But as we are seeing, it's always a time to discuss this kind of thing, because almost like every day, it seems one of those three freedoms are being challenged in one way or another. So it's something that we are passionate about, and we keep it going. And we have not only the Diefenbaker lecture, but in the spring coming up, we'll have our RAND debate, where we will debate the various issues that are live and are in the public realm. So without any further ado, we want to thank you again for coming, but we want to welcome Dr. Julie Ponesse. And Dr. Julie, thank you for being with us. And I just want to also say she has the Hero's Journey course that she is running right now. And if you really want to learn about the importance of ethics and so on in the modern world, you need to sign up and be a student of hers. You have an opportunity to be her student. And so thank you for being with us, and we look forward to your presentation tonight.
Well, thank you. That's lovely. And thank you for coming on this very drippy night. I think I owe you an apology, because I came up on the train yesterday and left. I got on at the St. Mary's train station, which is the nicest train station close to my home. And as soon as I stepped out the door, waiting on the platform, it started to rain. And I think it didn't rain through all 11 hours on the train. And I think I brought it because when I was walking around Ottawa today, it was lovely and it was sunny for the most part. But I think the rain has caught up with us. So thank you for coming out on this drippy night. Thank you to Augustine College, the First Freedoms Association, and to Barry in particular for inviting me. Can you all hear me okay? Yes, even in the very back. Okay. Barry is one of those people who is doing exactly what we all need to be doing right now. He's looking at what's happening in Canada, and he sees that something is going terribly off track. And he's doing everything he can to remind us that for the last, 157 years, and actually quite a bit longer than that, we were sought out to escape war and persecution, autocracy and slavery, and as being a place where people could make the kind of life they want for themselves, and where they were able to, or they thought they were able to, speak and live freely. He is one of those voices that, as Matthias Desmet says, must continue to speak out even when it seems no one is listening, and even when you're facing great opposition. It is making a difference, Barry, I promise you that, and I'm incredibly grateful for your voice. Thank you. Now, this lecture takes us back into history for two different reasons. First, it reminds us of another Canadian who was looking at the Canada of his time and felt that things weren't quite right. 2 years before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was officially adopted by the UN, and in response to seeing Canadians being treated as second-class citizens merely because of their names and their racial origins, John Diefenbaker began drafting a document in which he wrote, "I am Canadian, a free Canadian, free to speak without fear, free to worship God in my own way, free to stand for what I think is right." I think it's hard to read those words tonight, 64 years after Diefenbaker's Bill of Rights was enacted by our Parliament, without wondering, are we free today? Are we free to speak without fear? Are we free to stand for what we think is right? Well, we can only hope that by continuing to speak, even when our words fall on deaf ears, and even when we face incredible opposition, we will enjoy those freedoms one day again soon. Second, this is a night of remembrance, and the act of remembering takes us into history, unavoidably. It makes us confront where we've come from, who we are indebted to, what we have done, both good and bad. Remembrance Day celebrates heroes in particular, but celebrating heroes today is not only countercultural, it's often seen as an act of ignorance or even rebellion. We have undergone a shift in perspective in which individual victims came to eclipse heroes as the subject of history. And because of that, our history has become a history of shame. It's become an account of what the world has done to people instead of what people have done to or for the world. And I can say that I happen to be one of those apparently radical thinkers who believes that history is important. Nuanced and complex, yes, but also fixed and unrevisable. And that remembering the past with all its triumphs and all of its mistakes, its victims and its heroes, gives us a necessary starting point for our future by making us see how we're all connected and indebted. And what I'd like to do tonight is to tell you a story. It's a story that takes us to the heights of human ingenuity and the depths of civilizational collapse. It's a story that takes us through history and literature, social psychology, philosophy, and even some theology. It's a story that starts from the idea that we need to understand the past not through the lens of what has been done to us, not through the lens of what made us victims, but as the first step toward our future, a future that we can make and not be forced into, a step toward our humanity rather than a turning away from it. And it's a story that starts with the following question. Do you remember where you were when it happened? Who you were with? That moment when you first felt the ground shift beneath you, when your friends seemed a little less familiar, family a little more distant, when your trust in our highest institutions, government, medicine, law, journalism, it all just started to unravel. The last time your naive optimism allowed you to believe that the world is generally as it seems. Our last innocent moment. If you are reading this or hearing this tonight, then there's a good chance that you have your own last moment of innocence, even if the details of it are a little hazy. Sometime in 2020, there was a fundamental shift in how many of us view the world. The delicate network of core beliefs about what makes it possible to navigate life with some measure of stability and reliability, that medicine is a patient-focused institution, that journalists pursue the truth, that the courts track justice, that our friends would behave in certain predictable ways, it all started to unravel. There was a paradigm shift in how we live and relate to each other, a shift in attitude, a shift in trust, a shift away from a world that we can never revisit, an innocence we can never recover. There was the before times and the after times, and though we probably didn't know it then, there would be certain unrecoverable changes to life from which we're still reeling. That's from the first couple of pages of my book, Our Last Innocent Moment. And I started writing that book almost 3 years to the day after the World Health Organization declared COVID an emergency. 3 years of watching our medical, legal, political institutions crumble, or at least reveal the slow devolution they'd been undergoing for decades. 3 years of seeing how 2020 was, to somewhat regrettably borrow Joe Biden's term, an inflection point. One of those plastic moments in history where we experience a change of course so significant that it's hard even to remember what came before. Can you even remember what happened before 2020? I don't know, I struggle myself. Now, we're flailing in all dimensions of life. We face unprecedented levels of national and personal debt, which are nearly double what they were in 2007, chronic health and mental health epidemics, skyrocketing violent crime, and the realization that we are, at every moment, just one missile strike away from nuclear war. Our food and healthcare systems are quite literally killing us, and our children are being mutilated by a pantheon of corruptive ideologies that are hard to see as anything other than a form of public ritualistic sacrifice. Not to mention the unfathomable paradigm shifts and potential harms made possible by AI and brain-computer interfaces, editable humans, mRNA self-replicating vaccines, deepfakes in the metaverse, and pervasive digital surveillance. But far more destabilizing than any of this is that as a people, we've become untethered from the basic commitments that once grounded us. We set ourselves adrift from life framed by core Western liberal values: liberty, equality, autonomy, the values that our Bill of Rights takes for granted. And all of this leaves us standing at a precipice where we can no longer take some very basic ideas for granted. The idea of democracy, the idea of reasonableness, and the idea of the value of individuals. In many respects, we are the frog in the simmering water, wondering if now is the right time to jump out of the pot. Our position is so perilous that some are starting to ask, is our civilization actually on the verge of collapse? In 2022, the journalist Trish Wood wrote, "We're living the fall of Rome, though it's being pushed on us as a virtue." Civilization collapse was the subject of geographer Jared Diamond's 2011 bestseller, Collapse, and it's a prominent subject on the World Economic Forum website, although there it's part of their climate change and epidemic preparedness propaganda. Whether our civilization will collapse or not, I think it's reasonable to ask, if we survive this moment in history, what will life look like 100 years from now? How healthy will we be? How free will we be? Will life be recognizable? Or will we go the way of the doomed Viking colony in Greenland, the Aztecs, the Anasazi, the Qin dynasty of China, or the collapsed iconic Roman Empire? When scholars talk about civilizational collapse, they typically refer to stresses that overcome a society's coping mechanisms. Stanford Classics professor Ian Morris, for example, identifies what he calls the 5 horsemen of the apocalypse, the 5 factors that show up in nearly every major collapse: climate change, famine, state failure, migration, and major disease. Will we be wiped out by climate change or an epidemic? Maybe, I don't know. It's not really my area of expertise. Nor am I that interested in civilizational collapse as an extinction event. My interest tonight is in the decline of the aspects of our civilization that make us human: civility, civil discourse, and how we value the components of a civilization, its people. My interest is in whether there is something within our civilization that is creating our current catastrophe and what might be able to bring us out of it. And that's what I'd like to focus on tonight. After the initial shock of the events of 2020 started to wane, and while everyone seemed to be focused on who was to blame, how the global elites came to control big pharma and nearly every major world government and media outlet, and how our prime minister was connected, and all quite rightly, the questions that began to consume my thoughts were much more local and personal. Why did we give in so easily? Why were we so vulnerable, so quick to turn on each other? Why did we forget and even revise history so easily? I started thinking about other historical moments where we seem to fail in the same ways, and that unfortunately took me to some of the worst of them. The human rights atrocities of World War II, of course, but also the late Bronze Age collapse, the destruction of the Roman Empire, moments where we seem to have taken ourselves to the edge of human ingenuity and then fell, not by external invasion, but by our own errors and our own misplaced ambitions. And then I started thinking about the biblical story of Babel and how much the events of our time echo it. Just over 5,000 years ago, somewhere in the middle of the desert in the land of Shinar, south of what is now Baghdad, Iraq, a group of migrants decided to stop and build a city. One among them suggested that they build a tower so tall it would reach the heavens. And other than the fact that we know that they used the new technology of the time of making artificial stones, namely bricks, from mud, we don't know very much about what the tower looked like, how high it reached, or how long it took to build. What we do know is that God came down and, so displeased with what they were up to, confused their language and scattered them over the face of the earth. In 2020, I think we experienced another Babel moment, a system failure on a global scale. We'd been building something, innovating, expanding, and then it all went terribly wrong. It's a story of the natural consequences of human ingenuity running ahead of wisdom. It's a story about misguided unification projects. It's a story echoed in so many of the fractures we see today between the left and the right, liberals and conservatives, Israelis and Palestinians, truth and lies. It's a story about what's breaking between us and within each of us. And so I wondered, do all these Babel moments have something in common? And is there something in us that keeps bringing us back to them? One thing I think we can learn from these examples of civilization collapse is that they're not always due to a calamitous external event like Bedouin charging in from the desert. More often than not, the cause of their destruction is complex and internal. If you are a student of classical literature, the Greek and Shakespearean tragedies in particular, you might recognize something familiar in them. In each of these stories, you find tragic characters with the very thing that all tragic characters have in common, a hamartia, or which is just the Greek for a tragic flaw or tragic error, that leads the character to create his own destruction. So Oedipus's blindness led him to bring disaster to his city and family. Macbeth's vaulting or blind ambition set off a chain of events that culminated in his own demise. And for a more contemporary example, it seemed to be excessive pride that led the science geek school teacher Walter White in Breaking Bad to destroy everything, including his own family. So I wondered, is there a tragic flaw that runs throughout history and humanity that led to the crisis we face now, something that every so often just rears its ugly head and takes us perilously close to our own destruction? I think one thing that characterized the COVID years, the COVID narrative in particular, is the language of safety, purity, immunity, and perfection. To offer a couple of examples, in 2021, NPR cited studies describing superhuman or bulletproof immunity to COVID. And an article in the British Medical Journal the following year claimed that the virus could simply be eradicated. The shots, the masking, the distancing, the words, it was all designed to give the impression that by our own efforts, we could control nature, something, absolutely, perfectly. The evolutionary biologist Heather Heying, when diagnosing the failure of the COVID shots, located the problem not so much in our attempt to control a virus. The problem, she said, is that we had the audacity to think that our attempts to do so would be infallible. And she wrote, "Humans have been trying to control nature since we've been human. In many cases, we have even met with moderate success. But our arrogance always seems to get in the way. The attempt to control SARS-CoV-2 may well have been an honest one, but the inventors of the shots ran into problems when they imagined themselves infallible. The solution was deeply flawed, and the rest of us weren't allowed to notice." The problem, Heying said during a longer conversation, was the nature of the idea. It's an idea that allowed for no caution, no questioning, and certainly no dissension, because it was an idea that was already perfect. Or so we thought. I think there's a lot of the Babel story in this. Babel is a cautionary tale about what happens when we get intellectually too big for our britches. The Babylonians wanted to build a tower that extended beyond their capabilities, to transcend this world, to make themselves superhuman. And they thought they could dissolve the distinction between heaven and earth, the mundane and the transcendent. To borrow the term made popular by U.S. Congressman Stuart McKinney, they thought their idea was just too big to fail. But more than this, I think the wow factor really hit Babel. They became obsessed with their new invention. They thought, we'll make a name for ourselves. Not to provide housing, not to promote peace or harmony, but to become famous. And to paraphrase Rabbi Moshe Isserles, fame is the aspiration of those who see no purpose in life. For all we know, the builders of Babel saw no purpose in their project. They wanted to build something big in order to feel big. But when you use technology without purpose, you're no longer its master, you become its slave. The Babylonians had invented a new technology, and that technology, as it so often does, was reinventing humankind. Babel wasn't just a tower, it was an idea. And it wasn't just an idea of innovation and improvement, it was an idea of perfection and transcendence. And it was an idea so lofty it had to fail because it was no longer human. I think leading up to 2020, we were similarly audacious. We were arrogant. We bought into the idea that every aspect of our lives could be made immune by an ever-expanding and fine-tuned set of laws and policies designed to keep us safe, by vaccine technology, by hacks aimed to make our lives easier, more efficient. The "we can, so we will" attitude barreled forward without the "should we even do this?" question to guide us. And if perfectionism is the tragic flaw that got us to this place, if it's responsible for our blindness and our innocence, what can we do now? How do tragic characters in the Greeks, in Shakespeare, how do they typically deal with their tragic flaws? How do they recover from them? And what can we do about ours now? Well, one thing that makes a hero tragic is that, maybe the very thing that makes him tragic, is that he undergoes a catharsis, a process of intense suffering and purging through which he's forced to confront who he really is and what it is about him that led to his downfall. Specifically, tragic characters undergo an anagnorisis, from the Greek word for to make known. That moment when the hero makes a critical discovery about the reality of the situation and his part in it, undergoing a shift from ignorance to knowledge. I think it would be fair to say that we're in the midst of our own painful catharsis. As we start to see what it is about ourselves that got us here. And it's a painful adjustment. Like Gatsby, we've had our years of indulgence and gluttony. We've had our projects of reckless pride. We've overspent and underthought. We've outsourced responsibility for every facet of our lives: healthcare, finances, education, information. We built the tower, and then it crumbled all around us. And something significant needs to adjust for that. So how do we convert our innocence into the kind of awareness and accountability that will get us back on track? How do we become human again? Well, one thing that's interesting about the doomed civilizations I mentioned earlier is that some of them had all 5 traits or characteristics of imminent collapse, and they bounced back anyway. What made the difference? Well, if you take Rome, for example, in the 3rd century AD, now I'm not going to we don't have time to delve into this too far, and I recognize it's very complicated. I think there was, in addition to Gibbon's, there was a German textbook that identifies 210 possible explanations for the decline of the Roman Empire, so I don't mean to oversimplify things. But what was interesting is that before the empire actually falls, in the 3rd century AD, Emperor Aurelian made a concerted effort to place the good of the people above his own personal ambition. He secured the borders, he defeated breakaway empires, and he reunited the empire, for a couple hundred years anyway. Similarly, in the early 7th century AD, Emperors Gaozu and Taizong of the Tang dynasty of China not only made brilliant political and military maneuvers, but they seemed to understand the limits of absolute power. I think one lesson from these 2 examples is that really good leadership matters, right? Fortunately, I think we're entering an era where really good leadership is possible. But what rescues civilizations is often much more cultural and much simpler even than this. Do we have any Irish here tonight? We don't have one Irish person? What are you, 1/16th Irish? I'm about 1/16th Irish, okay. That would have been much more fun if all of you had raised your hand and said you're Irish. Well, for the 1/16th of you that's Irish, your ancestors might have just helped to save our civilization. I'll tell you why. Has anyone heard of Skellig Michael? Well, it's a remote, I hadn't either until about 6 months ago. It's a remote rocky island 7 miles off the west coast of Ireland. It's beautiful, it's beautiful. Oh, I should put it this way. How many of you have seen the more recent Star Wars movies? Then you've seen Skellig Michael. It rises 700 feet out of the rough sea. It is, for its obvious, I think, otherworldly qualities. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a location of a number of the more recent Star Wars movies. I'm not a Star Wars fan, so don't quiz me on which ones, but I'm told that it was the location for the filming. For most of its history, Skellig Michael was basically a third world country with a Stone Age culture, but it had one moment of unblemished glory. As Europe was collapsing into chaos in the 5th century, and barbarians were descending on the Roman cities, looting and burning books, and really anything associated with the classical world, a small group of Irish monks in a monastery on Skellig Michael, the remains of which they're still there to this day. They took up the painstaking task of copying every bit of classical literature they could get their hands on, making them basically conduits through which the Greco-Roman and Judeo-Christian cultures were transmitted to the newly settling tribes in Europe. While the Romans were unable to salvage their once grand civilization, with this simple act, the Irish saints rescued it and brought it into the future. Without the monks of Skellig Michael, the world that came after, the world of the Renaissance, the world of the Enlightenment, the world of the scientific revolution, the world we live in today, might have been entirely different. It would at least have been a world without classical books, for a while anyway, and a world without the history, the ideas, the humanity they contain. And by the time we get to the Renaissance, several centuries later, humanity was able to continue to rescue and reinvent itself after nearly a millennium of social regression, cultural stagnation, and rampant violence after the fall of the Roman Empire. The Renaissance was in many ways a reset. It was a reset of our literacy, art, and architecture, a reset of our presumptions about the value of questioning and certainty, of individualism, of humanism. I think we desperately need a similar reset today. And don't worry, I'm not talking about the kind that Klaus Schwab is advocating for. That kind. I knew you would worry. It's not the right crowd to make that joke in. But I do think we need a reset of a kind as an antidote to our tragic flaw, our obsessive perfectionism, our hubris, our arrogance. We need to remind ourselves that living well is not necessarily a matter of living bigger or faster or across more dimensions, or that we become successful by sacrificing ourselves for the collective. And I think we need to remember that there are three things we need in particular. First, we need a return to humility. One of the great lessons of Babel is what happens when pride gets out of hand. It goeth before destruction, Proverbs tells us, and it is the original and deadliest of the 7 deadly sins. It is, as the ancient Greeks knew, a foolish way of investing energy in the humanly impossible. The opposite, humility, as C.S. Lewis wrote, is not thinking less of ourselves, but thinking of ourselves less. Pride gives us the false impression that we can build towers to reach heavens, and the cure is to realize and embrace our own unique natures and see our place in something greater than ourselves. Second, we need to realize that human nature can't be transformed instantly. In the fall of 1993, Alexander Solzhenitsyn delivered a speech at the dedication of a memorial to the thousands of Frenchmen who perished during the Vendée genocide in Western France. During his speech, he warned against the illusion that human nature can be transformed in an instant. He said, "We must be able to improve patiently that which we have in any given today." Isn't that so beautiful? I'm going to read that again. We must be able to improve patiently that which we have in any given today. I think we need patience today. Our tragic flaw, if it is as I have described it, took a long while to fester and grow and deceive us into the place we're at now. And we need to give ourselves time to go through the awakening, the painful adjustment we need to cure ourselves of it. But we don't just need patience. We need active patience. We need to speak when we're able, to keep a soft heart when it would be easier to harden it, and to water the seeds of humanity we do find when it would probably be simpler just to plow them under. Finally, we absolutely must not give up on meaning. In Goethe's Faust, the story of a scholar who sells his soul to the devil in exchange for knowledge and power, the fundamental motivation of the devilish Mephistopheles is to make us so disenchanted with our humanity that we just give up on the project of living altogether. And isn't that the ultimate way to destroy us? To convince us that all the little choices we make every day are futile, that meaning and purpose are a fool's errand, and that humanity itself is an unwise investment. And in the face of this, we must simply decide that we aren't going to let meaning be stripped from our lives, that there is no amount of money or fame or promise of safety that can replace that feeling of living with purpose. Our lives mean something, and they mean just as much as they did before we were told that they mean nothing. But meaning isn't passive or spontaneous. We need to give meaning to things, see meaning in things, and we need to keep doing it even when the world refuses to validate our efforts. Let's go back to the Babylonians for a minute. They got something fundamentally wrong by aiming for something outside themselves. They tried for transcendence and destroyed themselves in the process. Human meaning isn't to be found in trying to perfect ourselves, in trying to rise above our fragility, but rather in sinking into it and making ourselves more human by doing so. At this moment, we're not so unlike the Europe of the 4th and 5th centuries, standing at a precipice of barbarism and illiteracy. Nearly half of Canadians today are unable to pass a high school level literacy test, half. And 1 out of every 6 adults is unable to complete the most basic literacy test, like filling out a job application. And those of us who are technically literate spend more time reading emails and text messages and social media posts than in any kind of sustained engagement with lengthier, more demanding texts. Although this might be an exception to the rule, this audience, because a number of you told me before we even started tonight the books that you've just read, so we might not be speaking to the choir here. I think we desperately need a resurgence of literacy in a very broad sense, if for no other reason than because being broadly literate frees us from narrow-mindedness and the myopia of thinking that our times and our value and our struggles are unique. It also makes us understand that things are rarely black and white, but usually some mixture of the grays in between. It might not be a coincidence that Abraham Lincoln, who paved the way to end slavery, was known to have read everything from Aesop's Fables and John Stuart Mill's On Liberty to Plutarch's Lives and Mary Chandler's Elements of Character. Literacy is not elitist, and it is certainly not gratuitous. It's essential to our civility, if only because it makes us part of the great human conversation that cuts across time and space. Sometimes I allow myself to make a wish list for the future. If I could, snap my fingers and change the world, or rub the genie's bottle and ask for the things I most want, what would I wish for? Some things are pretty clear. We need government to release itself from the control of deep state elitists. We need our scientists to cling fearlessly to curiosity and free thought. We need our physicians to rise above their obsessive compliance and protect their patients, whatever the costs. We need journalists to report facts and not transmit ideas. And we need humility to triumph over hubris, individualism over collectivism, and as controversial as it may be to say, nationalism over globalism. Over the last 3 years, we've seen humanity move pretty quickly and disloyally from one heroic figure to another, Tam and Fauci to Gates and then Zuckerberg, and even in the freedom camp from Danielle Smith to Elon Musk or some other Olympic figure who will bring fire to the people. We've become conditioned, so deeply conditioned, to outsource our thinking to the current savior of the moment, however worthy that person might be. But the truth is, there is no politician who will save us, no billionaire who will cure what's really broken in us. Yes, we were lied to. Yes, we were betrayed. Yes, we were manipulated. Yes, we need to gain control of our captured institutions, and there will be a long and well-deserving list of people to bring to account for that. But at the end of the day, what we need to focus on first and foremost is regaining control of ourselves. We need to read better, think better, remember better, vote better. Goodness. I try to be diplomatic, I really do. We need to learn how to speak out when it be easier to remain silent, and when we face great opposition. We need to learn how to hold tightly to the mast as the torrent blows around us. There's some very positive things happening in the world. Within days of being elected, Donald Trump announced his plan to deport illegal migrants en masse and revoke Joe Biden's policies on gender-affirming care, and he appointed a regenerative farmer to the USDA. I think what we saw in America last week was not just a shift to a new political regime, but a powerful mandate from a people who said enough is enough. At some point, the intricately woven but ultimately thin woke narrative started to fray. Americans are done being ignored. They're done being told they're racist, sexist, fascist. They're done being fed a legion of well-orchestrated lies, being told their common sense is unsophisticated and dangerous. They're done being a pawn in someone else's game. What that election did is it created a shift where we're no longer in the minority. We aren't crazy or fringe. We're just simply human. But as promising as all those developments are, the greatest things happening today have nothing to do with politics. Civilization is being awakened. We're a hungry people, and we're hungry not for safety and security and protection and perfection. We're hungry, desperately hungry, to be part of something bigger than ourselves, whether we know it or not. We want to live a life that, however small, we can be proud of, and that will form a meaningful chapter in our descendants' memories. In big and little ways, our civilization is being saved every day by the saints of our time, by unrelenting, truth-seeking citizen journalists, podcasters, and substackers, by freedom lawyers and physicians, by ex-urbanites learning to grow their own food, by parents who are taking their children's education into their own hands, and by an uprising of Canadians who are simply no longer willing to be told that our lives don't matter. There are well-known, well-highlighted heroes leading the charge, but let's also remember the heroes walking among us we may never know, who are saving our civilization in little ways every single day. I think we are very clearly in the middle of a war. It's not just a political war, a health war, an information war. It's a spiritual war, an existential war, a war about who we are and why we matter. What got us into trouble in 2020 is that, like the Babylonians, we tried to become something we just aren't. We tried to become gods, and ironically, by doing so, we turned ourselves into savages. If we're to redeem ourselves, we need to remember that more important even than perfection is refusing to give up on the sacred concept that is at the core of the dignity of every human life: reason, passion, curiosity, respect for each other, and humanity. And if we remember those things, we will have gone a long way to reclaiming them. Our job as humans is not to become perfect. Our job is to figure out what our function is, what our unique talents and capabilities are as individuals, and then do the very best job we can to offer those things to the world, without excuse, without blame or resentment, even when things aren't perfect, and especially when things aren't perfect. When the history of our time is written, this period will be a case study for students of global corruption, classical tragedies, and mass psychosis, and will be used as an example of what humans must never do again. I thought we'd learned that lesson on the plains of Shinar 5,000 years ago, and in that courtroom in Nuremberg in 1946. But it seemed that we needed to learn it again in 2020. We're lost, sure. We've made mistakes. We set our sights too high, and in doing so, we forgot our humanity. But we can work through our tragic flaw and remake our future. Our last moment of innocence could be a sign of our collapse, or it could be our first step forward. Thank you.